A pleasure and honor to introduce Joe Altonji, who will deliver this year's Mortensen Lecture. Joe is the Thomas DeWitt Keuler Professor of Economics at Yale University and a research associate at the NBR. As most of you know, if not all of you, Joe is a leading figure in labor economics and has made important contributions in a large number of areas in the field. Today I will highlight only a few of his many contributions. The first area that I want to highlight is labor supply, where Joe's early contributions have helped shape our understanding of the way that households choose whether to work and how much to work. Two key publications in this area were a 1982 paper published in the Review of Economic Studies and a 1986 paper in the Journal of Political Economy. In this work, Joe challenged the idea that cyclical fluctuations in employment are optimal labor supply responses to expected real wages and prices, which was an important assumption of many macro models. And he provided key micro evidence on the intertemporal response of labor supply. The second area that I want to highlight is a set of papers that Joe wrote with Hayashi and Kotlikov on altruism within families. This work challenged the idea that the extended family is a relevant unit for economic decision-making, a finding that has important implications for the design of social insurance programs. This work led to several important publications in the 90s in journals that included the American Economic Review, Journal of Political Economy, and Econometrica. A third area is Joe's seminal work on the role of statistical discrimination and employer learning in explaining wage disparities across groups defined by education, race, gender, and other characteristics. Joe's best-known work in this area is a paper with Pierre that was published in 2001 in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, which developed a simple but extremely clever and powerful empirical test of statistical discrimination and employer learning, and which has a wide range of applications. Joe has also made important contributions methodologically in econometric analysis. His best-known work in this area was to develop a method that uses selection on observed variables to address selection on unobserved variables. This method also has a wide range of applications and has been widely used in various empirical fields in economics. His most well-cited publication here is a paper with Elder and Tabor that was published in 2005 in the Journal of Political Economy. And the last area that I want to mention is the determination and dynamics of wages, earnings, and family income. Joe's earlier work in this area, broadly defined, includes a seminal paper on the effect of job seniority on wages, which was published in 1987 in the Journal of Political Economy. Today, Joe will be talking about more recent work on the determination of earnings and family income. And I could go on and on, but I should give you a sense of the breadth and significance of Joe's contributions. It therefore comes as no surprise that Joe's work has been recognized with numerous honors and awards. To mention only a few, Joe is an elected fellow of the Econometric Society and of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and he's currently president-elect of the Society of Labor Economists. And this year, he was a recipient of the 2018 IZA Prize in Labor Economics. Finally, on a more personal note, I want to take this opportunity to say that I have always felt very fortunate to have had Joe first as my PhD advisor and then as co-author and friend. I hold a deep admiration for Joe's intellectual rigor, thoroughness, and integrity, and I also deeply admire his commitment to teaching and to sharing his knowledge with others. So it's truly an honor to introduce him today. So please join me in welcoming Joe Altonji.
Thanks very much, Yvonne, for that very generous introduction. It's really a great honor to have the opportunity to give the Dale Mortensen lecture. It has special meaning for me. I knew Dale first through his classic early papers on unemployment and job search. I can remember spending hours and hours on those papers when I was a graduate student, working on macro labor market fluctuations. He managed to convince Northwestern's economics department to take a chance on me early in my career. And I had the privilege of being his colleague at Northwestern for 16 years. Dale and his wife Beverly, welcomed us to Evanston, and we had many, many wonderful times with them. And I got to experience him as a colleague. Dale set a standard as a researcher, as a mentor, and as a citizen of our profession that one really can't meet. And he was a warm and generous person, as wonderful a person as he was a scholar. We miss his scholarship, we miss his leadership, and we miss his friendship. So today I want to talk about earnings, marriage, and family income, dynamics, and distribution. The questions that I'll be discussing are: what drives the distribution of family income that an individual experiences during adult life? What factors determine earnings and non-labor income dynamics and distribution? And what are the channels through which these work out, effective in unemployment shock, for example? The keys are in the labor market and in the marriage market. In the labor market, ability, education, on-the-job training, unemployment shocks, job search, randomness in what offers people get, and labor supply shocks and labor supply preferences are key. In the marriage market, time spent married versus single, and whom one marries, which determines the labor market potential and earnings of one's partner. In this talk, I want to discuss recent research really on three elements that relate to these questions. Dynamic models of individual earnings. And I'm going to start with univariate models, but because of the short time, I'll be very brief there and just remind ourselves of what some of the themes have been in that work. I'll spend a fair amount of time on earnings, on multivariate models of wages, hours, and earnings. I'll kind of I'm going to discuss three papers that take three different approaches, and summarize some results on the sources of earnings growth, the role of job shopping experience and job tenure, on progress in understanding how shocks work themselves out in determining earnings, and then on what those models have told us about what drives the distribution of earnings. Then I'm going to turn to bring the family in and talk about earnings, family formation, and an individual's family income. Most of this work will be, I'll be talking about ongoing work with Yvonne Budangos and Diza Hinsjo. And I think as you've heard me talk for a little while, you'll probably wish that I had introduced Yvonne and he gave the plenary talk. But I'll do my best. And I'll also talk about some related research, and I'll close with research directions. So modeling earnings. So there's a huge literature, it's still very, very active literature on univariate earnings processes or univariate income processes and their links to inequality. There's a long history. I think the work really got going in the 70s. The questions are the nature of the earnings process, random walk, heterogeneous slopes. Some of the really active research in this area is on normality, whether shocks have normal distributions or not, whether the process is nonlinear, and I think we know now that they're not. These models are critical inputs to the study of consumption, measurement of risk, and measurement of uncertainty. They're important in trying to understand inequality, important work dating from Moffat and Gottschalk's papers in the 90s on the role of persistent and transitory shocks in inequality and the changes in inequality over time. Finally, in the role of in trying to measure insurance through taxes and transfers, and through income of other family members. But there are, well, sorry. While this work is very important, there are limits to what we can learn from univariate models. They don't provide information about the specific sources of variation, things that drive earnings, or their relative importance. And we need to know what's moving earnings around if we want to design social insurance. They don't provide information about the channels through which certain kinds of shocks work their way through. You need a multivariate model for that. And so that's what I'm going to turn to now. I'll talk for a while on multivariate models of earnings, wages, unemployment, and hours. There's a growing body of work on this, but it was really pretty thin, I'd say, until maybe 10 years ago. The early papers are largely statistical. Probably the key ones are McCurdy and Abad and Cart. And I'm going to discuss three approaches. Two of them are structural. The first is the paper by Bagger, Fontaine, Pastel-Benet, and Robin, or BFPR, their 2014 AER paper, which actually does model wages and employment. I'll highlight the results on wages. And then the second is the paper by Lowe, McGeer, and Testafari, or LMP. Then the second, the other paper I'm going to discuss is a statistical paper. I put it in the statistical camp, but it's actually, I think, closely guided by theory. And that's my paper with Tony Smith and Yvonne Bedangos. So let me start with BFPR. When I forget the initials, I'll then resort to Bagger et al., but BFPR. So they provide a structural model of wages, employment, and job mobility. The setting, they provide an equilibrium search model. The key features are, and the key one is that they have heterogeneous firm productivity. I'll use the symbol P, it shows up again. They also have heterogeneous worker productivity. They have transitory worker-specific productivity that's valued at all firms. They have human capital accumulation, again, general human capital. And workers can search both from unemployment and on the job. Key feature of the model is wage bargaining in response to outside offers, building on some prior work by Pastel-Benet and Robin. And there's job loss, there's exogenous job destruction. So those are the key features. The data is matched employee panel data on wages, job spells, unemployment spells, and critically firm output, which gives them some empirical leverage to be able to identify the role that heterogeneity in firms plays in the distribution of wages and in career wage dynamics. So the main findings, so one of the key goals of the paper is, in fact, to answer an important question really about careers, which is why do earnings rise over a career? And they find that human capital accumulation and job shopping, gains in P, productivity of the firms, explain most of the wage growth over a career. Human capital is most important for the high education group. Gains from job shopping are largest in the first 10 years, as you would expect when you think about a search model. There's a lot of heterogeneity between workers in the same firm and between workers in different firms and within firm wage growth. And the interpretation of that is that it's driven in part by the outside offers workers are receiving and the firm has to respond to. You can think of the growth within the firm as a return to tenure, but it does not account for wage growth over a career. The share of the pie that workers get in whatever firm they're in doesn't grow with time. I'm going to skip this graph in the interest of time, but it kind of just basically lays out what I just told you. The paper also presents a very interesting wage variance decomposition. So again, we're trying to explain, what is it that determines the distribution of wages? And they find that the contribution of the variation in this unobservability component is small for both education groups. The variance in the transitory productivity component, again, at any given experience point, is modest and relatively constant through time. The variance in firm productivity is very large and increases with experience. And the variance in the piece rate, that is the fraction of the output that the worker's getting, is large, but it's constant. And the overall contribution of the piece rate combined with productivity is less than the sum of the two because they're negatively correlated. And they're negatively correlated because in some sense kind of the basic economics of the model. Firm productivity rises over time as workers locate and then move to better jobs. But workers get a lower piece rate when at the start of a match with a high productivity firm. That firm just has to match their best option. And the worker thinks about the future prospects of the fact that she will be getting offers down the road and the firm will respond. I might say that there isn't this calculation isn't in the paper. But my guess is that if you added up earnings over a career, or wages over a career, you'd find that the variation in ability is probably quite a bit more important because it's affecting earnings in every job. Okay, so let me turn to Lowe, McGeer, and Pistafari, their 2010 paper, also in the AER. So they have a utility-based model. They specify a utility function, preferences over consumption and employment. Workers maximize expected lifetime utility. They have an intertemporal budget constraint, and they can save, but they can't borrow. There's a random walk process for individual productivity. They have job match heterogeneity in their model. Workers can search from unemployment and from on the job, as in the BFPR. And they have exogenous job loss or job destruction. The paper considers transfers, food stamps, disability insurance, and unemployment insurance are modeled in the paper. And the choices that the worker makes are, for each period, are how much to consume, whether to work, whether to move to another job if an offer arrives, and whether to apply for disability insurance. They also provide a decomposition of wage growth. And they find that their results for highly educated workers are that job shopping contributes about 1/3 of wage growth. Again, more early in a career, as you would expect from the logic of a search model. Human capital is about 2/3 of the growth. For low-educated workers, there's less growth overall, and job shopping and human capital contribute equally till age 45. Job shopping is more important later, which seems a little bit surprising to me. The paper examines sources of risk and the value of insurance. They don't decompose the variance in lifetime earnings, income, or consumption, or really even decompose its value, the distribution in a cross-section. Although their model, you could I think, use it for those purposes. But what they do, and what it's possible for them to do, is estimate willingness to pay to reduce wage risk and job destruction risk. They can do that because they have a utility-based model. And their findings for wage risk are pretty interesting. For the highly educated, to illustrate them, highly educated workers would be willing to pay about 19.2% of their sort of steady-state consumption to avoid a 50% increase in the variance of permanent wage shocks. With the results, and I'll illustrate the results for job destruction by talking about the low-educated workers. Low-educated workers would pay 5% of their consumption to reduce their risk of losing a job to the level of high-educated workers. And the paper estimates the value of disability insurance and food stamps. And again, with this type of a model, you really have the tools to begin to think about how to design social insurance and how changes in, again, in labor market processes would affect that design. Okay, so let me turn to the third paper, Altonji, Smith, and Vidangos, or ASD. So we provide a joint model of earnings, employment, job shopping, job changes, wage rates, and work hours. The equations approximate the decision rules based upon the current values of the state variables. What's missing is that they're not dependent on wealth. So that's the sense in which they're not really fully the conditions for an intertemporal optimization. The key features, some of the key features of the model are duration dependence in employment and in job matches, multiple sources of unobserved heterogeneity, job-specific components in wages, but also in hours. So there's a firm-specific component to the amount of hours you can work. And there are multiple shocks, and we account for measurement error. We use the model to identify the channels through which various shocks operate. We estimate the dynamic response of wages, hours, and earnings to various shocks. And we decompose the variance in lifetime hours, wages, and earnings, and attribute it to these various exogenous variables and shocks that are in the model. Okay, so let me sketch the model for you. The exogenous variables are race, education, and potential experience. Those are the observed exogenous variables. And then an unobserved ability component, mu I, and an unobserved mobility component, eta I, plus the shocks. At labor market entry, workers draw an employment status shock that determines employment. It also depends on their heterogeneity, their types. They draw an autoregressive wage component, capturing general productivity, and we use the symbol omega for that term. And they draw a job-specific wage component, Vij, and a job-specific hours component, Xc. And excuse my cosmic ear isn't here to criticize my pronunciation of Greek letters. But I was born in Brooklyn. I'm doing the best I can. So let me talk about the wage model. Wages depend on, again, education, experience, race. The ability component, mu I. The productivity component, this transitory or persistent productivity component, omega IT. I should mention that unemployment spells reduce omega IT in the model. The job-specific component, V, and on-job seniority. So there's a true tenure effect in our model. The model of employment transitions and job changes, we really actually have two different models in the paper, and I'm going to talk about the one that we treat as our main model, and it's actually the one that fits the data best. I actually like the economics of the other model better, but we'll just talk about one. So we have an equation for transitions from unemployment to employment. They depend on, again, education, race, potential experience, on ability, on this mobility component A to I, which shows up in several equations, and it's fairly strongly related to these employment transitions and to job changes. And then there's IID shocks. The probability of remaining employed, given that you were employed in the prior period, again depends on X, on the potential wage that you'll get if you stay employed, the ability term and the mobility heterogeneity term, how long you've been employed. We have employment duration in the model, and an IID shock. So let me talk about job-to-job mobility. Here we have elements of, I think what you would think of in a standard search model with a twist. The employed receive, they receive a draw, V prime ij of t, of the job-specific wage component from a potential employer. In contrast to most of the search literature, we assume the distribution of that draw depends on the job-specific component in the current job. So you can see this autoregressive equation. Quite sure where I don't know whether that works or not. You can see the equation in the middle of the top third of the slide. And we find in the parameter varies a bit across the models, but we find a fairly strong relationship. And so the results say that wages are based upon salary histories. Offers are based on salary histories or related to past job quality in other ways that we discuss in the paper. And BFPR's bargaining model provides a kind of an explanation for why that might be. I think some other parts of that story, I think, have to do with that sort of human capital, that there are markets for human capital, and what you were doing in a given job, it's a mix of being specific in general. And part of your, you may be in a niche where you get paid well and there are other jobs like it, or potentially have something having to do with labor market networks. Okay, what about back to quits? Well, quits depend on the heterogeneity terms. In particular, the term affecting wages, the productivity term, also affects quits. And on job tenure, which I left out of the slide, and an IID shock. Quits drop, the better the current job you're in, the higher the value of the job match term. They tend to rise when you get better offers, and they are decreasing in job seniority. There's definitely state duration dependence in job matches. In a model where we do have, again, we have match heterogeneity and as well as individual heterogeneity. I should mention the unemployed get a new draw of a job-specific component, but that's at random, so they lose the connection to their prior offers. All right, the final part of the model, important part anyway, is annual hours, and then earnings follows. So annual hours depends on employment status at the survey date, the heterogeneity terms, the wage rate, the job match specific hours component XE, and an IID error term that's capturing short-term labor supply shocks and also temporary hours reductions at work or temporary layoffs. And again, the reason we have the job match hours component is that it's a really important feature of the data. I did work a number of years ago with Christina Paxson, where I think we established this, and there's a number of papers since have as well. So annual hours are determined by wages in hours, but in addition, we include an earnings component that reflects variation in overtime pay or compensation that's not being picked up in our hours and in our average hourly wage measure. Okay. The data is the panel-sided income dynamics, male household heads, and we estimate using indirect inference. So I want to talk about three things really from this paper. The first are dynamic effects of labor market shocks or impulse response functions. The first is a little bit overly busy figure that's illustrating the effects of several different shocks. And I'm going to just draw your attention to a couple of them. I should say, there's actually a slide later, I probably should have moved up. Just how did we do this? Well, basically what we did is we simulated the careers of many, many people using the distribution of education and basically birth cohort of the sample. And that then gives us the mean pass of the variables for the model. Then what we did is at experience level 10, we introduce a shock. And then after the shock, we then just let the model run. And so what I'm displaying here is the difference between the counterfactual and the base. And so there's no difference up to the point of the shock. And then I want to draw your attention to the blue line that's labeled unemployment shock. And the scale is in logs. The vertical axis is in logs. And what you can see is someone who experiences job loss such that they're unemployed at the survey date, we estimate to experience a 60%, it's actually not a 60%, but a drop of 0.6 in logs of their earnings. And the dynamics are fairly sharp. They're two-thirds of the way back in 1 year, basically, you'll see in a minute that their hours, because their hours recover. And then the recovery is slow after that. And we'll turn to that in a second. But before I do, I just want to illustrate another use of the model. And it's to study the effects of a job change. But it's a random job change. And the way we think about it is perhaps something happened such that the job just doesn't fit in well anymore with perhaps your family life. Maybe something's happened with your commute. And you quit, but you're basically doing this at random. You're not moving to another job. And what you see is that the workers lose suffer about a 9% wage loss if they do this. And it's a mixture, I won't show you the breakdown, but it's a mixture of lost seniority and lost job shopping capital. And then that slowly recovers as workers acquire tenure and move into better jobs. Okay. Let me go to the next slide, which has two figures in it. And what I want to do is I want to lead you through the decomposition of this loss of earnings due to unemployment. In the left panel, we're showing the response of log wages to the unemployment shock. And again, the scale on the vertical axis is in logs. And what you can see is that wages fall by about a little bit more than, by about 0.2 in response to the unemployment shock. And then they slowly recover. If you look in the right panel, you can see the hours response. And hours basically are all the way back after one period, not quite. We use the model in the paper. We talk about some of the other shocks and how to think about the dynamics of them. But what I want to do is I want to show you the breakdown of this 0.2 in logs wage loss. In the equation for the persistent wage component, unemployment enters. And there's a drop of 0.12 from the effect of unemployment. Lost job tenure contributes another 6%, 0.06 in logs. And then the drop in the job-specific wage component is 0.02. A lot of the unemployment spells are occurring to relatively young workers. They haven't acquired that much job shopping capital. So that's the breakdown. That's what you can do with this kind of a model. All right, let me turn back to a question that we looked at using both of the other papers, the contributions of general human capital, job shopping, and tenure to wage growth. So this figure breaks it down, and the blue line at the top of the slide is total wage growth. On the bottom, the axis is potential experience, and again, it's on a log scale. And you can see that log wages rise by about around 0.9 over the careers of these workers. The kind of brownish red line, dashed line in the next from the top is the contribution of general human capital, and that actually is about maybe 2/3 of the total growth. Job shopping and job tenure contribute about equally, and again, by late in the career, workers have gained around maybe 0.14, 0.13 from each of these. Again, I would have expected job shopping to be more important early, and maybe there's maybe some issues with the model there. Okay. Let me turn back to impulse response functions, but this time look at the variance in wage growth. So there's a literature in the Univariate literature on heteroscedasticity and whether dynamic processes for wage variances. And in this model, it's an endogenous event. So this figure looks at the effects of two shocks. One of them is a job change shock. That's the line labeled with the green label. And what we're doing in this figure, the vertical scale, is the ratio of the variance of earnings growth, not the level of earnings growth, in the counterfactual relative to the variance in the base. And you can see it really spikes up and then remains up a little bit. After you change jobs, you have lower tenure, you're more likely to have another job change. And you're also maybe more likely to move for a better offer. The second one I want to highlight is the effect of an unemployment shock. So again, there's this big spike. There's a lot of variation in how long you're unemployed. There's variation in the quality in the job offer that you get coming out of unemployment. But you can see that this variance is elevated for a while. It's slowly, and in part because there's state dependence in employment. You're more likely to have another unemployment spell. Okay. All right. The final thing that I want to do with the model is decompose the variance in lifetime earnings. And I want to, as a caveat, let me just mention the estimates vary somewhat across education groups and model specifications. So I'm going to just show you. I'm going to show you our kind of lead case, our base case. So first of all, we find that in all the specifications that things having to do with movements into and out of unemployment and job mobility are very important for the variation in the sum of lifetime earnings. Together, they account for 43% of the variance in the sum of lifetime earnings. Job-specific wage shocks dominate for wages, and they're actually more important for earnings. Job-specific hour shocks dominate for hours. Education, the third result, education accounts for 30% of the variance in the sum of lifetime earnings, and almost all of that is through its link to wages, not through its link to hours. Okay. Finally, we looked at the issue of how much uncertainty is resolved early on if, in fact, workers knew about their permanent components, which are, we have a literature on to the extent to which they do. We find that unobserved heterogeneity, education, and the initial values of the general skill and job-specific wage components account for 55.3% of the variance in the sum of lifetime earnings and 44.6% of the variance in the sum of lifetime wage rates. So a lot of uncertainty would be resolved early if you have the information. Okay. All right. So what I want to do now is bring marriage into the picture. And again, this is based on joint work with Diza Hinsjo and Agon Bedengos. All right, so our approach, we build a dynamic model of earnings, marriage, non-labor earnings, fertility, and family income. we simulate earnings, marriage, and lifetime income and family income over a lifetime. And the model is similar in spirit to my prior work with Tony and Yvonne, but it's more descriptive. I think it's certainly less kind of closely tied, I think, to the theory. It's also a much, much bigger model. The estimation approach, we estimate the equations mostly separately using simple methods like multinomial probit, dynamic multinomial logit, method of moments in a few spots, instrumental variables, ordinary least squares. We're dealing with unobserved heterogeneity often in individual equations, but we're not handling correlation across equations well. It's hard to do that without having a system estimator. And some of the coefficient estimates will be inconsistent. The data is for panel studies income dynamics, 1969 to 1996. This work relates to a vast literature. It obviously relates to the multivariate earnings models, to the labor supply literature, to work on marital status, children, earnings, and family income, to the literature on marriage formation and sorting. It's the big literature on no sorting. I think the kind of theoretical underpinnings of our model is much more in the spirit of the work on marriage formation and sorting, where the literature is smaller. And Dale Mortensen, I should have mentioned, has a very, very interesting 1988 paper in which he talks about basically search and matching in the labor market and in the marriage market. And in particular, the paper by Wang, empirical work and recent work by Gusa, Giacomo, and Robin, 2017. And then marital sorting and inequality, where there's, again, a lively literature. So our contribution is to bring together earnings, a model of earning processes for men and women, a model of marriage formation, dissolution, marital sorting, and fertility into a model of income dynamics. And we make compromises along the way. So here's the earnings model. I'm just going to sketch it, and here and there mention some selected results. So first, almost all the equations include education. Education's interacted with a polynomial either in potential experience or in age. There are separate equations for men and women, and for women, most of the parameters depend on marital status. I should mention that I think almost every equation in the model has a quadratic or a cubic in time. And we're using data from a very wide set of birth cohorts. The model of labor market transitions, status transitions, here we use a three-state model. It's a dynamic three-state model of employment status at the survey date. We have employment, unemployment, and out of the labor force. It's very important to use a three-state model because particularly once you have, in a model with married women, there are many people who are really not searching. And so you just to try to treat everyone with one state really doesn't work very well. We have separate models for married women, for single women, and for men. In the case of men, we have marriage controls, but we don't distinguish single and married men. We have unobserved heterogeneity in the employment transition model, and we have state dependence. Some of the results is a positive effect of education. It's stronger for women. There's strong state dependence. There's a strong negative effect of children and of marriage on employment. That's for women, not for men. We find unobserved heterogeneity is important. And we find that wages don't matter much for the transitions. Sorry. So we have a concept which we had in the earlier paper with Tony and Yvonne on earnings dynamics of a latent hourly wage rate. There's for the bottom point, for non-employed workers, this captures, in some sense, a process of wage offers, what they would get if they spent some time looking for a job. There's separate models for men and for women. And for employed individuals, the wage is just the latent wage. So let me tell you a bit about the wage model. I thought I'm going to skip that slide and show you another one, save a little bit of time. So wage depends on ability, again, mu. Marriage depends on marital state, unemployment, and employment. And these are all treated as endogenous. We use the panel variation to deal with correlation with the fixed unobserved heterogeneity term. The persistent wage component, omega, is again picking up general skills. But we don't have a model of job mobility here. We've abstracted from that. That's one of the compromises that we've made, unlike the earlier work. And at age 25, workers get a draw of omega. So I'm going to illustrate the model using the equation for log hourly, the hourly wage of women. And I have to say that Yvonne asked me this morning whether these actually were the current numbers, and I thought they were, and I checked, and they're actually not, but they're pretty close to the current numbers. So the dependent variable is the wage rate. You can see education. Women are getting about 10% higher wage for each year of education. They have a small negative marriage premium. Men have a small positive marriage premium. And there's their children, there's a negative effect of children on wages, as a lot of the work on women's wages and career wages have found. The effects are actually a little bigger in the middle, for middle children. I think that's actually a cumulative effect of the prior children. And then at the bottom, you can see the process for omega. We find a coefficient of 0.85, so there's fairly strong correlation, but nowhere near a random walk. Notice that if you're employed, you get a boost in the next period. If you're employed in the prior period, your wages go up. If you're unemployed, your wages go down in the next period. And notice the intercept is minus 0.045. Omega has a zero mean. So if you're out of the labor force, your wages are drifting down. And we interpret it as your skills are depreciating. And when you come back, that will gradually wear off. And there's a fairly substantial heterogeneity in the component. Okay. So log annual hours, the structure is similar to the prior paper. It's hours conditional, but now that's not just on employment at the survey date, but also whether you were unemployed at the survey date. And we have wages, age, education, individual heterogeneity, marital status. For single and married women, we had children. We put them in for men, and they just didn't show up much, so we took them out. For married women, spouse's wage enters with a positive coefficient, and the spouse's unemployment status enters positively. So there's an added worker effect here. So let me now turn to the equations for marriage and divorce. First, the single to married transition. The latent wage and education raise the probability you'll be married in the next period for single men, but they don't affect it for single women, suggesting that that labor market potential matters more for men in the marriage market. Young children raise the marriage probability, and that's true for men as well as women. What about the married to married transition? Husbands and wives' education both enter positively. The husbands and wives' latent wages are both in the model, but they don't show up much. We looked at mismatch by entering the normalized gap between spouses' wage rates, education, and age. By normalized, what we meant is the deviation from what is the typical age gap. So men typically are older than their spouses, so we look at deviation around that. And these variables were not very important. Actually, age is statistically significant. It's fairly strongly significant, but it's not a really strong effect. There's an unobserved match-specific match quality component, as you know, what economists call love in the model. It's a fixed component. We don't estimate a model where it drifts, and it's important. We find strong positive duration dependence in marriages, and there are IID shocks in the model. What about marital sorting? The way we model this, essentially it's conditional that the marriage started. So we're looking at marriage. It's a selected sample, but I think it's fine for our purposes. So we're looking at marriage spouse characteristics at the start of the marriage, given what your characteristics are. And it's important to say that we need to have initial values of all spouse characteristics that enter the earnings model. So we have multivariate models for the distribution of spouse education, age, labor force status, the permanent wage component, the autoregressive wage component. And I might mention that own children enter into the equations for the spouse's education and for the wage. Just a few sorting results. There's strong sorting on education and age in keeping with the vast literature. Own wage raises the spouse's latent wage rate. The effect is actually bigger for women than for men. It's 0.5 for women, 0.3 for men. And own education raises the spouse wage rate, and there it flips. It's 0.02. That's the effect of the women's education on her husband's wage, and 0.05 for men. This is from a multivariate regression, so both of these variables are in at the same time. And for men, having children lowers the education of the spouse that you can attract, I guess is one way to think about it. So non-labor income. So basically, if non-labor income is capital income, public transfers, and private transfers, gifts from friends and relatives, for example. And we basically have, it depends on your last year's non-labor income, education, age, children, and then the variables that drive earnings, like hours, employment, and wages. For married couples, both husbands and wives variables enter. And family income is just, go back from logs to levels, and it's just the sum of earnings of the individual, earnings of their spouse if they're married, and then unearned income. Okay. Initial conditions for employment, marriage, and children. The first period of the model corresponds to age 25 of the PSID sample members. So they're the individuals I'm talking about. And I won't have time to discuss. We have to start at 25 for reasons that have to do with the structure of the PSID. And so what we do is we just take the joint distribution